Hello and welcome to another book review. Today I'm reviewing Better Never to Have Been. This is a non-fiction book and it's a philosophy book. It was written by Professor David Benatar of South Africa. David Benatar is what's known as an anti-natalist, meaning he's got very strong views when it comes to bringing new people into existence and having babies, basically. According to David Benatar, coming into existence is always a net harm, never a benefit. Meaning, when a new person is born, that person will go on to experience a lot more pain and suffering in the world than it will pleasure and joy. Benatar's views on this are so strong that he actually describes any two parents or two procreators as the tip of a generational iceberg of suffering, meaning by having children they're causing additional people to suffer, and those people will have their own children, and those children will have more children, and in the end there will be a big group of people all suffering in the world, and it will all be due to the original two parents. Very strong views. So how does he justify his belief? How does he explain this anti-natalism? Well, he does so by pointing out an asymmetry between pleasure and pain, and he does so by using this diagram. So, on the left-hand side we have an existing person, and on the right-hand side, on the right-hand column, we have a non-existing person. Let's start over on the left at the top. So, for an existing person, we have the presence of pain. Now, of course, this is bad. If somebody exists and they experience pain, that's a bad thing. Moving down, we have the presence of pleasure for an existing person. Now, of course, that's good. If somebody exists and they experience pleasure or joy, that's a good thing. So, moving over to the right-hand column at the top, a non-existing person, we have the absence of pain. Now, of course, that's a good thing. If somebody doesn't exist, and so they are then spared pain or suffering by not being born, that's a good thing, because they're being spared pain. Moving down, it's got the absence of pleasure. Now, many people would say that that's bad, because that non-existing person is missing out on pleasure that it could have had. But according to Benatar, that's not true. If somebody doesn't exist, they can't possibly lose out by not experiencing that pleasure. If the person is non-existent, then they're not losing out by missing out on pleasure. Okay, so that's it. Using that diagram, that's the basic premise of the book. That's the most important part of the whole book, that diagram, that asymmetry between pleasure and pain. So, with that in mind, why do so many people seem to be so blind to this? Why do so many people in the world continue to have babies when it's quite obvious, to Benatar at least, that there's more pain than pleasure? Well, he puts this down to something called the Pollyanna principle. The Pollyanna principle is like a psychological concept that most human beings have, which make us see the world through rose-tinted spectacles, so to speak. If you go up to somebody and ask them to recall their life so far, they will tend to remember all of the good parts, but completely forget all of the bad parts. All of the days that they were depressed, or all of the bad days, all of the days that they were sick or ill, they'll tend to kind of overlook them, and they'll remember the good times, like the holidays, or the parties, or the presents that they received or something. They'll remember the good parts, but completely forget the bad parts. And there's actually a strong evolutionary reason for this as well. Evolution favours optimists and positive people, because in order for the human race to survive, we need to pass on our genes and reproduce. And if everybody was pessimistic and depressed and they saw life for what it really was, they probably wouldn't have babies, and so they wouldn't pass on the genes and the human race would fizzle out. So human beings are quite... we have a tendency towards the Pollyanna principle, and according to Benatar, that explains why the population is rising and we keep having babies. He points out that the optimists and kind of cheery, happy-go-lucky people often have a much less realistic view of the world than depressed people. He kind of makes a point that Thomas Ligotti makes in his book, that if you're depressed, rather than that depression being a sickness, it can actually mean that your brain is working better than most other people's, because you're seeing the world more clearly and you're seeing the world exactly for what it is. It's a horrible thought, but it's probably true, to be honest. Benatar points out that human beings have a right not to exist. And if two parents bring a baby into the world, they kind of violate that person's right. A lot of parents, if asked, they say, I had a child because I want that child to go on to experience all of the pleasures in life. But Benatar points out that by doing so, they're kind of inflicting harm on a human being in order for that person to gain pleasure. And he thinks that that's absolutely wrong, and he uses quite a good analogy for this. So if you went up to most people and said, is it okay to inflict harm to spare somebody a greater harm? They would say yes. A good example is if somebody was just had a car crash and they were trapped in a car wreckage, most people would say it's okay to break that person's arm to get them away from the wreckage so that they can avoid any further harm. That's okay. That's inflicting harm to avoid further harm. But to inflict pain to gain pleasure is wrong. So if you ask somebody, is it okay to break somebody's arm so that they would then have £10,000, or break their leg so that they could have a higher IQ or some other kind of benefit, most people would say that that's wrong, even though they would probably have a child at some point. But if you have a child, you're subjecting that person to a lot of pain, as in the pain of the world and the pain of existing, just for the sake of that person experiencing pleasure. It's a very interesting point, and unless somebody explains that to you, you might not realise it, but it is very true. So he thinks that having a baby so that that baby can grow up and enjoy the world is not a good reason to have a child at all. He also points out another interesting point, that a satisfied desire is equal to no desire. So, and what he means by that is, if somebody is born and comes into existence, they have no benefit over people who don't exist. He uses a strange example for this one, but there are two people, and one person is given a tablet or a pill that gives them a desire to see a tree painted red, and the other person has no pill and no desire. And somebody goes up to the tree and paints it red, paints the tree red. So the person who's been given the tablet has that desire satisfied, and so now they're content, they're happy. But the other person never had a desire to see the tree painted red in the first place, so they're also happy. So a satisfied desire is equal to no desire, and that's another way of him explaining that coming into existence is of no benefit to never coming into existence. Some people, of course, consider themselves lucky to have been born, which goes completely against his views. And to this, David Benatar compares considering yourself being lucky to have been born akin to considering yourself lucky to have a luxury suite on board the Titanic while you await the ship to sink into your watery grave. That's a strong statement indeed, but that's how David Benatar sees it. And he also speaks about abortion in his book. He speaks quite a lot about the abortion arguments that have been going on for years. And in his opinion, he thinks abortion needs no kind of justification at all. It's the failure to abort a child that needs justification. Bearing in mind that coming into existence is always a net harm, if somebody fails to have an abortion, they should have a very good reason for not doing it, not the other way around. That's another very interesting angle that he sees things from. He criticises other reasons that parents give for having children as well. A lot of parents have children for reasons of vanity, so they want to see another version of themselves in the world, and they want to pass on their genes to kind of leave their mark on the world. But he kind of rejects that by giving the analogy of somebody making a clone of themselves for vanity reasons. If you found out that somebody had made a clone of themselves just because that person was quite vain and they wanted to see another version of themselves in the world, most people would say that that's wrong. But still, if somebody has a baby because they want to see another version of themselves in the world, most people think, yeah, that's okay, it's fair enough. But it's not when you think about it. And also, a lot of parents have children so that they can kind of use those children to serve a purpose. And again, some people would say that that's okay. So some parents want their other child to have a sibling, so they have a child for that reason. Or some parents have children because they want somebody to care for them when they're older. But Benatar says no, that's not right. If for example, there were a couple who needed an organ donor for another child, their child needed a liver or a kidney, and they then had a baby, so that baby could be used as a donor, most people would say, no way, that's wrong. But if somebody said, I want to have a child because I need somebody to look after me when I'm older, most people would say, yeah, that's fine, that's no problem. So he comes at these arguments from very unique angles, and it really does make you think. He describes having children and procreating as playing Russian roulette with a loaded gun, because it's not a case of whether or not that child will suffer. That child will definitely suffer in the world. They'll have to experience all kinds of pain and suffering and frustration in the world. So it's Russian roulette with a loaded gun. Every squeeze of the trigger will have a bullet, which is very interesting. On the other hand, he completely accepts and he admits in his book that nobody will stop breeding. Even after this book was published, I think it was published in 2006, he doesn't think for 1 minute that people are going to stop reproducing. He thinks people are going to see his book just as a philosophy book to read one day and put down. He never thinks it's going to happen, but in his eyes, the most noble thing to do for the human race is a kind of phased extinction. He thinks it would be much better off for everybody concerned if everybody just stopped reproducing and let the human race completely die out, because that way there would be much less suffering in the world. He also points out that his views are actually philanthropic rather than misanthropic. It would be very easy to come to the conclusion that David Benatar despises the human race because he wants to see everybody gone and he doesn't want new people to be born. But he stresses the fact that the opposite is true. He cares a lot about the human race, and that's why he doesn't want any more people, because he knows that human beings always suffer, and so his views are philanthropic, meaning they're formed out of a love for the human race, and I believe him as well. My criticisms with this book is that the prose is way too technical and pedantic. It's written by a professor and it's a science book, so most science books are written in a kind of technical way, but I think this one is especially so. Every single point that he discusses, he kind of splits hairs with, and he looks at it from every single different angle, and it does get tiring after about 50 pages. So I recommend that you only read this if you're really interested in the subject and you want to read more about this topic. I'll leave you with a short quote from the book. This is one of the most famous quotes from David Benatar's book. Here we go. "It is curious that while good people go to great lengths to spare their children from suffering, few of them seem to notice that the one and only guaranteed way to prevent all the suffering of their children is to not bring those children into existence in the first place." There you have it. David Benatar, better never to have been. Thanks for watching. I'll be back in another week or two with another book review. In the meantime, head over to jamesflynn.org for more of my content. Have a great day and see you next time.